Nobody can deny that we're living in a time of unprecedented change. Whether it's the climate, pandemics, AI, or political unrest, there are a lot of events that have us confused and wondering how to make sense of it all. My name is Rebecca Burnt, and I'm asking the big questions, like what is the long history of our planet and its people? What are the ideas and practices that help us find purpose and meaning and navigate change with courage, faith, and hope? This is the unfolding, faith beyond borders. I first encountered today's guest a little over a decade ago when I learned about the work of a collective of artists and writers called Dark Mountain. Its founders, Dougald Hine and Paul Kingsnorth, were former journalists and environmentalists who had both reached the end of their rope. From their vantage point, catastrophic climate change was unavoidable. All the climate policy, carbon taxing, and campaigning in the world couldn't stop it. What would it look like, they asked, to face that truth and feel our grief? And beyond that, to question the narratives of progress and modernity that had brought us to this point. Dark Mountain became a series of publications and festivals that sought to unmake civilization and rewild culture, rooting humans back in the soil and more ancient and anarchic modes of perception. I remember sharing their manifesto, Uncivilization, with a friend of mine at the time. Like many critics, my friend recoiled in horror, seeing it as a sort of decadent exercise in pure nihilism. But I was quite taken with it, and I felt that it mirrored some of my own thoughts and experiences that developed from my work as a critical care nurse. I saw that so often people want to believe that modern technology can and should solve every pain or discomfort, including death itself. And when people come to the end of their life, a refusal to accept death often made suffering worse. I saw that when people could accept the end, it opened an opportunity for something more, not the elimination of suffering, but the possibility of finding beauty and meaning, and yes, even emotional catharsis and healing in the midst of it. Dougald Hine has since moved on from Dark Mountain and has a new book out called At Work in the Ruins, Finding Our Place in the Time of Science, Climate Change, Pandemics, and All the Other Emergencies. If Uncivilization was the work of two heretics seeking to disrupt the story of progress as usual, this new book feels like the product of an older and more contemplative perspective. He speaks of a coming, quote, humbling from which none of us will be spared, which will not be managed or controlled, but will leave us changed, unquote. And he asks how we can find ourselves once again in an older, more cosmological vision, which we have always belonged to. Although he doesn't touch on this too much of the book, part of this cosmological vision seems to run through Christianity. In fact, some of Hine's former Dark Mountain collaborators have publicly converted to Christianity in the past few years. For Hine, faith seems to have been a constant in his life, though not something engaged entirely uncritically, which I can also relate to. In addition to his early career as a BBC journalist and co-founding the Dark Mountain Project and a school called Home, Hine has collaborated with scientists, artists, and activists, serving as a leader of artistic development at Sweden's National Theatre, Riksteatern, and as an associate of the Center for Environment and Development Studies at Uppsala University. He co-hosts the Great Humbling podcast and publishes a Substack called Writing Home. Welcome, Dougald.
Thanks, Rebecca. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, good to be with you too. Let me start off by asking you, could you just tell us a little bit about your upbringing and how that shaped the way you see the world, especially when it comes to maybe what we might call a more spiritual or philosophical kind of perspective?
Sure. I feel like the older I get, the more I begin to see the connections in like how I became someone who did the things that I've spent my life doing. And, you know, when I was born, my dad had just started at theological college. So I spent sort of the first 3 years of my life with our family living in this tiny cottage in the grounds of a theological college in Cambridge, England. And then when I was nearly 3, we moved to Leeds, and I grew up as minister's son in a United Reformed church. So my dad's mum came from Scotland, had a Presbyterian background, and the URC was sort of the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists had come together in the UK in the 1970s. And so that was this sort of broad low church background, not especially evangelical, although there were people in some of the churches that we were part of who definitely would have identified as evangelical. My dad had known Rowan Williams when they were both undergraduates at Cambridge and both involved with the student Christian movement then. So that's, if you like, this sort of backdrop. But also, like, what that meant in practice was that I was growing up with one community of my peers at school where everything's organized in the ways that schools are organized, where you have a group of kids of exactly the same age bonded together with one or two adults in a position of control. And then this other community in which obviously, like, my dad was a kind of central figure, but also there were all of these grown-ups and children and young people of different ages. My dad was a student chaplain at Leeds University during those years when I was in primary school. And so we always had students around the house. And when I look back, part of what it is that, for me at least, growing up in that generation in the north of England in a church context gave me a lot of the things that being part of a village would have given people in lots of times and places, of this kind of intergenerational community of care as well as community of faith. And like, the older I get, the more I see how there are things that I went out into the world as a grown-up taking for granted, not even necessarily seeing about myself, that shaped what I ended up doing, that were born out of just the everydayness of that, I guess.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that idea of being in this community of care, that was something that I really experienced very profoundly also growing up in church. And it was something, I think, and I've been in a few intentional communities, but in a lot of, I think the other projects I got involved in, whether it was activist projects or whatever, I think I was always seeking to recover that in some way. And even now, I think when I go to churches, it does feel like in some ways there's often a more consumerist, at least in America. It's a little bit more of like going for, to get entertainment either, or just to sort of like get something out of it. But I really I kind of miss that experience of that multi-generational community, and knowing that there were these people who had known me my whole life and cared for me. That was quite profound.
Yeah. And I think you're right about that sort of consumerist turn. And it can be as simple as that our culture trains us so well to be consumers that even when we go looking for something different, I remember Martin Shaw saying this years before his turn to Christianity, but that we're so well trained at being consumers that when people come to a workshop that he was leading or whatever, with the best will in the world, the behavior that's been modeled to us is how to consume. And he said the best thing about what he was doing with taking people out on these wilderness rites of passage retreats was you're basically preparing people and then leaving them for a 4-day and night vigil with just like water and a tarp for if it rains and nothing else for 4 days and nights on their own. And he said, by the end of the 4 days, the body is starting to eat itself. The price of entry is to be consumed. And we don't have that many spaces in our societies where there's a clear sense that the price of entry is costly in ways that don't allow you the safety of being a consumer. And you're probably right that even churches have been shaped by that tendency within society over the decades.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me ask you, in founding Dark Mountain, how did you, in doing that work there, how would you characterize like your evolution from that to kind of what you're doing now and writing this new book? What's stayed the same and what's changed over time?
Yeah. I mean, apart from anything else, I was at a different stage in life when Paul and I met. I was just heading towards turning 30. He was heading towards his mid-30s. It's not a big difference in age, but it can be quite a significant one. I think he had kind of made something of a name for himself through his dedication and work as an environmental journalist and activist. I was that bit younger. I didn't have a kind of reputation. In a sense, when we wrote the manifesto and when Paul wrote that first Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist essay, it was a bit like a kind of self-immolation of his professional identity or even his activist identity. People knew who he was, like among the people who were reading the manifesto, and in some cases were shocked and reacted strongly against what he was doing, and in other cases said, oh, I'm so glad that someone's actually saying this. And I was there because I'd seen the glimmerings of this in things that Paul was writing, and they'd resonated strongly with things that I was thinking about writing and talking to people about. But I'd been kind of moving in these in-between spaces between activism and the sort of policy and think tank world in London and tech and all kinds of and arts, and I'd been very shaken to the core by a kind of encounter with climate change and the sort of, I would say, part of the thing with climate change is that it's the one place where the parts of us that are most invested in modernity, the parts of us that grew up being taught where respectable forms of knowledge come from, can get a kind of an injection of or being thrown into a sort of prophetic calling into question of the world as we know it, the way we've been living, the stories we've grown up in, that will hit home because it's being delivered with the authority of science. And actually, there were plenty of other things that Paul and I were writing about in the manifesto and talking about besides climate change. But climate change was sort of the prism through which you can get thrown into that position of having it all pulled out from under you. And I was processing that and seeing the gaps within what we were saying within the movements around climate that I was involved in or around the edges of in sort of 2007, 8, 9. And Paul and I were having this conversation where it was like, okay, there's enough in common between what we're both feeling and seeing here. We both had this sense that I've often spoken about of the environmental movement becoming almost a church where the priests had lost their faith, but didn't think that the people who turned up on a Sunday in the pews were ready to hear the bad news. There was this gap between the public speeches that people were giving about climate change and what the same speaker would say if you knew them well enough to catch them over a whiskey at the end of the night, when they would admit to this kind of pessimism bordering on despair. And it's a bit like the early days of Dark Mountain. I mean, it's not an accident. It wasn't something we were conscious of at the time, but it's not an accident that Paul's essay was called Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist, because I know that you've written a lot about 12-step and something I've been learning a lot about in recent years. And that sense that step one is to give up, to admit your powerlessness. I think from a different direction, without really knowing about that lineage of hard-won knowledge and practice around recovery, we stumbled on the same essential truth, that we were at a place where before anything worth doing could be done, where anything worth saying could be said, we had to give up. We had to admit our powerlessness in front of the depth of the trouble that the world is in, and then realize that whenever you think you might have given up on everything, it's only on the far side of that you can see what's left, what was missing from your definition of everything. And for a long while with Dark Mountain, particularly because Paul was often the more prominent frontman for it, especially in the early years, I was the one who had the experience of kind of weaving disparate communities together, using the internet to get people to meet in real life. That was a lot of what I'd been doing in my 20s and playing around with. So I was applying that. and actually in hindsight applying the stuff that I'd learned growing up around church to convening the festivals and the kind of community of artists and writers and thinkers and collaborators around it. And from quite early on, that had to involve a sort of holding of a space that was not about, right, and what are we going to do? Because you get a bunch of people together where these things are in the room, these things are in the mix of the invitation. They arrive on Friday night, and you have this kind of very kind of mixed bag of things going on in a festival. And by Sunday morning, someone calls a big session where they're like, this is amazing. I'm feeling more energized than I have been in ages. What are we going to do? And I realized that part of the role then was for me to go, I don't think there's a we that can do here. Like, I think precisely the thing that has given us back some of the energy that's been drained from wherever it is we've come from is that this is a different kind of space. It's a more liminal space. It's a space of retreat, you know, in the spiritual and almost the kind of military sense of it, like withdrawal from whatever your front line is up onto the mountain from where you can take a longer view of things. And then you have to find your way back down and see what looks different when you get back there. But up on the mountain is not the place from which you can be making tactical decisions or imagining that everyone who's there is going back to the same situation or to come together and form a movement together. And so for 10 years with Dark Mountain, I was kind of in one way or another responsible for that. And this book came a few years further on. And in a sense, it's a kind of closing of an arc of a journey. It's like putting into something that isn't me the stuff that I learned and thought about and experienced over the kind of 15 years from when Paul and I began writing the manifesto to this point when I wrote the book, so that that's actually out there and can be useful to people. And then I can see all over again, like what's left, having given that away, having put that into the vehicle of the book, what's still with me, what's wanting to come out and come through and into what I do next. So I'm back in another kind of liminal space of going, what is next? What comes through? What shapes and lines are there on the far side of having, you know, spent a year taking that book out into the world and accompanying it on that journey, and now looking beyond that. So yeah, that's where you meet me.
Yeah. It's interesting. And one of the things you talk about in your book is how you say, I'm no longer talking about climate change, like, because that frame is itself, the whole conversation is itself just a product of the thing that is causing the issue to begin with. And I think it's interesting, like after I encountered Dark Mountain at first, that was around the time that I was starting to get involved in activism more myself, and was, you know, involved in some different movements that not primarily environmentalism, although that was always in the mix and kind of part if you're on the left, that's always like a piece of it. But it was really at the end of 2018 that I encountered, actually I was in New York City, and there was a meeting that a bunch of my friends were going to that said, we're launching this new movement. It's come from the UK called the Extinction Rebellion. And it was really clear to me, and looking at a lot of their material, I said, oh, they've been very influenced by the ethos of Dark Mountain. I'm sure that some of these people have been to Dark Mountain events and stuff. And I was quite struck by the idea of the fact that they highlighted that piece of sitting with the grief and being willing to face kind of some of the starkness of what the data science and everything, or what the data is showing us. And I got very involved. I helped to launch it in New York City. I was involved for several months, but I pretty quickly got to the place where I thought, oh, I don't think, or at least how it's being expressed here in New York City, which is itself a very interesting kind of energetic egregore that's present there in New York City. I think we're just still part of the problem, because what I see people doing is they talk about, like, yeah, let's feel the grief for 2 minutes at the beginning of the meeting, and then, oh, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And we've got to go. We've got to do this. We've got to do that. We can't stop. We've got to make sure that we get carbon emissions, down by, 2025 or whatever. And I felt what felt to me like this, it's funny because in some ways it was a consumptive energy of people being consumed, but consumed by their own fears and anxieties. And that was what was kind of being poured back into the work. And so I, after several months, kind of had to step out of it. And actually, I read Charles Eisenstein's book on climate, which was kind of helpful for me. But this is the second thing that I read that has kind of helped me make more sense of that experience. And I have friends that stayed involved much longer. I think almost all of them have finally kind of said, okay, I've got to step out of this now. Some are still involved in some climate work, and I support them, and I get it. But I'm also, I'm really interested in this thing that you're talking about in your book, which is how do we start to work in the ruins? How do we accept that there are going to be, there's going to be a dismantling of modernity to some extent, and there are going to be ruins, and this is this has always been a part of the human condition. This isn't anything new. How do we make good ruins, and how do we work well with those ruins? Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that? What that looks like?
Yeah, I mean, so part of the sense of talking about the ruins is not just to kind of look ahead to something that's coming and that we can't stop, but also to recognize the extent to which modernity has always been founded on ruins, on a kind of ruining of, ecologies and cultures. And that, whilst the pattern of it is asymmetric and it's not commensurable, that ruining of culture applies as much at the places that have seen themselves and had the power to enunciate themselves as the centers of modernity, as it does the places at the edges that have experienced the worst and most brutal forms of devastation of all kinds by those at the centers. And so we're starting among ruins, not least culturally. There's been a tendency in the environmental movement over its history to sort of see the fundamental problem as being what humans are doing to the environment and then the knock-on effects of that. And therefore to prioritize that kind of devastation of ecologies over the devastation of cultures and of the human capacity to be human together. What I tend to have been doing, even with my writing with Dark Mountain, but more so with the book and with the work that we're doing now with a school called Home, is drawing attention to the cultural side of that, to the extent that we can even separate them. The extent to which the ways of living that we, that you and I and many of the people listening to this were born into, look weirdly damaged from the perspective of anyone who's got one foot outside of what has passed for culture in Western modernity. They look damaged in the way that someone who had really bad things done to them in their childhood can look damaged. You don't have to know what exactly happened to see and have a kind of deep registration of both pity and fear. And I think that, for a lot of people who've got one foot outside of, what's taken for granted at the heart of Western modernity, those of us who are showing up out of that culture mostly kind of collectively create that same reaction of a combination of pity and fear, even without knowing all of the histories of it. And so naming this thing that we've lost a lot of the capacities for being human together, without which our ancestors wouldn't have survived, because we've been cushioned on, whatever it is, maybe 7 generations of colonialism and oil. It's not a huge amount in historical terms, but it's enough for whole societies to have forgotten or devalued so much of the skills and practices, which are the only things that allow human communities to hold together and humans to go on making life work. And so that's part of the sense of starting in the ruins, is that even before the consequences come home to the places where most of us are sitting, because we'll be insulated against it for longest, not least by the mechanisms of the market, already we are in some sense starting from a position of being kind of ruined, or at least, at best, maybe we're in remedial class as adults, waking up, recognizing some lack within the ways of being human that we grew up with, and trying to sort of bootstrap our way together into some approximation of what is called for to be worthy of the name of a culture, and kind of vaguely aware that we are lacking in things that you would have had to learn by the age of 8 in most of the times and places we might have been born other than our own. So that's kind of all of the stuff that I've tried to bring into the center of the conversations I'm part of, that rarely gets, that rarely truly lands in the center of a conversation that's framed in terms of climate, because of the authority of science and the way that climate change is itself a scientific concept, and we so quickly rush through to the what we need to do inside the frame of those assumptions, which doesn't bring into view any of what I've been talking about for the last few minutes, really.
Mm. You talk about these things that in other cultures we would have learned by the age of 8. What are some of those things that you think we're missing?
Well, it's the kind of woven together mix of the very practical skills of subsistence, and the emotional and human skills of making life work without acting out at every opportunity. Like we can get away with behaving like addicts in the kinds of societies we were born into, in ways that just you wouldn't last 5 minutes in lots of the places where our ancestors lived if you acted as childishly as most of us who call ourselves grown-ups are used to being able to act. I mean, I think of a man who I met, who was born in London. His parents come from a village, or on one side of his family, his father, I think it was, came from a village in the Himalayas. And when he was 6 years old, his grandmother called his parents and said, "You have to send him back now, it'll be too late." And so at the age of 6, he was sent back to the village of 300 people in the Himalayas. And he said to me, within 2 weeks, I'd forgotten I'd ever lived anywhere else, and I'd learned how to kill and pluck a chicken. And then at the age of 12, he was brought back to go to school in London. And he was like, yeah, within 2 weeks, I forgot that I'd lived there. And then somewhere in my 20s, I would hear myself coming out with these things, and my friends would look at me strangely. And I was like, I used to live in the mountains. And that's a kind of very, personal story of somebody whose life has literally straddled two utterly different worlds. But I think a lot of us in our ancestry don't have to reach that far back to find a world that's closer to that village in the Himalayas. And we don't have to, I always say, it's not about romanticizing the lives of our ancestors. They were hard in ways that we don't like to think about, just like we don't like to think about the lives of many of the people at the far end of the supply chains that our lives depend on in ways we can't easily extricate ourselves from. But it's kind of coming into a sober relation with the realities that are left out of the stories that most of us were born into, including the kinds of ones that a story like the one I just told brings into view, that starts to give us clues for what it might have been like. If you want one more example, John Moriarty, the great sort of Irish poet philosopher who Martin Shaw has been bringing to a lot of people's attention, who I guess was born in the 1930s in rural Ireland. He said, in the village that I grew up in the world that I grew up in if one morning we'd all woken up and everyone over the age of 14 was gone, those of us who were left could have run everything.
Mm.
And according to the logics of the schooling system that he was kind of picked up into and educated in, these were people who knew nothing. And that's the kind of stuff that we have to bring back into view, into the conversations, I think, in, you know, to make sense of what it means to be at work in the ruins.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to turn now to a little bit of continuing through this idea of what it looks like to make good ruins. I started off a couple weeks ago talking to Elizabeth Oldfield about this kind of resurgence of Christianity. And it's just a really interesting place for me to be as someone who has just grown up in that world of being very sincerely Christian and struggled with it at times for various reasons. To see people rediscovering it and to think through some of the narratives that we have, both about ways in which the sort of Western European Christian world, I guess, Christendom, if you want to call it that, has been the engine of some of this destruction, especially of a lot of ecosystems and people, and also yet how I'm not ready to throw it out. And so one of these questions that we've talked about in a little bit leading up to this is, what is it still good for? How do we orient towards it and think about reclaiming it without having that romanticized view of the past, you know, that says, oh, if we could, you know, because I grew up hearing this all the time. It's like, if we could just go back to the time of the Puritans when they, you know, we lived in every, you know, that city on a hill and everyone was Christian and everyone, you know, it's a world that never really existed. But yeah, what does it look like to sort of reclaim some of that, and also maybe we've used this term rewilding. What does it look like to rewild Christianity to some extent? And how can
Right.
that help?
Yeah. I mean, I've felt a lot of sort of resonance and kinship following some of your writing over the last couple of years around all of this, because yeah, it's been quite strange as somebody who grew up around churches, was formed by this kind of very quite humble, grounded version of Christianity that was there in my childhood. And, you know, unlike Martin, who also had a preacher as a father, Martin had kind of, by his late teens, completely walked away from that. As he would say, it didn't take with him. That wasn't my story. I was a kind of, you know, pilgrim between different churches of different flavors of Christianity through, you know, my 20s. And I think I probably also had a sense of being around the very kind of tail end of a world in which it had been part of the background rather than a kind of a consciously countercultural force in the way that it was becoming in those churches that were still, in some sense, thriving in the UK by the time I was heading into adulthood. So I had a kind of sadness of being around the ending of an institutional thing and of not really knowing how to show up in a way that was much help. And anyway, at a certain point in time, I had an experience of just somehow being released from any sense of obligation to this thing, the church. And that more or less coincided with the point where Paul and I were writing the manifesto and heading out into the world. And so by the time I was doing any work that anyone was paying any attention to, it wasn't a particularly visible or loud part of who I am. And so to then reach this place, you know, 15 years down the line, of seeing these, you know, dear friends of mine having very powerful experiences that draw them into what is for them a radically new relationship with Christianity and with this kind of wild Orthodox stuff that both Paul and Martin in different ways have headed into. It's a very curious thing, because I started to see people kind of commenting on YouTube things, about something I said in a podcast interview, going, like when's Dougald going to follow Paul and Martin? And yeah, it's not quite like that. But as this space in which it's possible to talk about these things has changed, how do I show up with the part of me that I don't know who I would be if it wasn't for those Christian roots, without getting I'm not interested in an identity politics of faith, which I think is so easily where it immediately goes these days. I was messaging with David Benjamin Blower, who's a wonderful songwriter and theologian who's become a good friend of mine, just before Christmas, and he said something. He said, I'm not interested in a Christianity that wants to point to itself as the answer, or that's most interested in talking about itself. Mm. And that landed with me. And then there's a phrase which another friend, Vanessa Chamberlain, came out with a little while back, where she talked about the sense of finding friends in the wilderness. And that definitely feels like where I am, in the company of, some folks whose journey is kind of taking them away in alarm from institutional contexts that they've devoted their life to. Others who are have journeyed a long way away from where they started out and find themselves, slightly to their surprise, being drawn back into a kind of living relationship with something that they thought had faded into the background of who they are. And I would describe myself as being in the latter of that, but in this very fertile encounter of trying to puzzle through, exactly as you say, like what's useful, what's truly alive. I sort of said in one thing I wrote last year, I never lost my faith, I lost my religion, which works for me as a distinction that has a kind of trickster quality to it, because it allows me to sort of slip the identity. But also, to anyone who is kind of attuned to 20th century theology, like, it doesn't put you as far away from what Christianity can be as it might sound like to someone who's coming completely from the outside, because there's a big, serious thread of thinking, starting from people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, about what a religionless Christianity might look like. So that's all sort of part of the mix. And one of the people who's really helped me with this is a guy called Andrew, who writes a Substack called Bogged Down and Aster. Mm-hmm. And he brought me this, he put it into a piece that he wrote, and then we've talked about it. This image that comes from Hannah Arendt in her lecture on Walter Benjamin, who was a good friend of hers, and she played an important role in bringing Benjamin's work into the light of day, because very little of it was kind of known in a way that would have lasted when he died. And in her lecture, she talks about that passage, that song from Shakespeare's The Tempest, full fathom 5, your father lies, of his bones are corals made, those are pearls that were his eyes. And Andrew wrote this beautiful thing where he's like, I think that's our relationship to our traditions now, is we're scavengers diving for pearls, where the sea change is real. We don't just get to go back to our father's Christianity or our father's Judaism or whatever tradition we're starting from within. Like, there may be other people who are having totally other experiences that don't fit what I'm describing at all, but this is what feels real and alive to me and to the sort of strange little community of folks that I've stumbled into in recent times. But we do, it's precisely what you do in the ruins, is you go scavenging for treasures, for things that, it's Federico Campagna, this Italian philosopher who I got into just as I was finishing writing the book. It has this whole thread about making good ruins. It's like, when you're born into the ending of a world, then the task is, on the one hand, to stop worrying so much about needing to make sense according to the logic of the world that is ending, and then to make good ruins, which is to kind of to look for the things that can be released and brought into the field of possibility for whatever comes after the ending of this world from among the structures and systems of the world that is ending. And I feel like there's a kind of parallel for me now between, on the one hand, the ending of the world of modernity, the ending of modernity as we've known it, and on the other hand, the ending of our religious traditions as we've known them, and the rewilding, although it takes me in different directions along different paths to where Paul and Martin are. I think part of what there is in common for us, and in common with all sorts of other people who would be far further removed from any relationship to the particular tradition of Christianity than I am, is some of that sense of, the scavenging, the diving for pearls, the making good ruins. Matt Osmond gave us a powerful image in a piece he wrote for Dark Mountain of the nurse log in the forest, the old tree that dies and in its dying releases the resources that are held within it into the possibility of life for all sorts of organisms around it. And that might be part of what the life of our traditions and institutions looks like at a moment like the one that we're in.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because that metaphor is something that I think has also been with me in the last several years, especially. I've been part of these conversations around what is Christianity, beginning like in the, probably like more than 15 years ago, with people who are coming out of evangelicalism and trying to find a way to still hang on to some kind of like this community nurtured me and was important to me, and also it damaged me in some ways, and like, what do I do with that? And there was always the question of like, well, what do we do with church? How do we build it now? How do we make it sustainable? And then it kind of became, especially as people became more involved in some of the mainline denominations, which tend to be more progressive and which have been on the decline for quite some time here in the United States. There's a lot of people talking about like, well, how do we save these? How do we save these institutions? And I got to the point where I really said, we can't, like, and if there's any hope of anything surviving, that's not the right question to ask.
Absolutely.
It's not about the institution. And that idea of, that is exactly the image I've had in my mind, that idea of both the idea of the nurse log that kind of dies and then seeds, provides this nourishment for all new kinds of life. The idea of ruins and like rummaging through these ruins and saying, okay, well, what can we salvage and what can we make something new out of it? The idea of, that comes from scripture, of the seed falling to the ground and dying so that it can be reborn. I've sensed that this is the time that we're in, and this is really what's going on. And yet it's interesting for me. I've tried to say, okay, well, this Christianity is kind of part of who I am, but that doesn't have to be the main thing. And I don't know how much I want to be involved in religion. And yet I have been pulled back to the actual religion piece time and time again, including when I've been on ayahuasca, including when I have been, in Prospect Park in Brooklyn in the middle of the night, chanting and making offerings to the goddess Hecate. Like, I heard her say to me once, yeah, you can do this for a while, but don't be so quick to let go of Jesus. And I think that Jesus to me has always been such I've had a hard time separating him from like the moralizing and the sense that I have to be good, like what would Jesus do kind of thing, I have to be like a good girl. So I've always had a fraught relationship with him, but it was like I just heard her say, he's my son too. And I thought, what does that even mean? I don't know what that means. But I actually quite like religion, because I think, at its root, what it means is it's comes from the same root as the word ligament, and it means to connect people to one another and to often place. And religion is what a lot of times does that deep work of culture building. And when we don't have anything, what we have instead is the market that does the culture building for us. And so with things like having sacraments practices that we come together around that kind of become touchstones for a community, I think that that's where religion really has a chance to offer some people something that's necessary. And yet, I think there's this thing that's happening where, always like it can become calcified and rigid, and it can kind of keep us trapped in an old way of seeing things. And so I've been asking myself this question of like, what is dying, and what do you need to let die, and then what wants to be revived, and how do I stay in that conversation where I don't have to be bound to like an ideal of religion, which I can get dogmatic about sometimes. It tends to have more to do with like things like aesthetics and like like things that I like my Eucharist to look this way, and I tend to have a very high church orientation towards that. I think partly in reaction to a very casual low church upbringing. I really love I think the spectacle of some of that, but also I have to recognize, it's not about what I like, it's about what is really serving people. And so those have been some of the questions that I've wrestled with, and it's felt important for me in recent years to actually reclaim that identity and say, okay, yeah, I am a Christian, and to not feel like I need to run away from it, I guess. But I'm also asking this question of how do I do that without it becoming, as you said, an identity politics? How can I hold that identity without being identitarian?
Yes, I feel like I'm still trying to find the words that will carry for the parts of this that are mine. And like, two things that came through in something that I was trying to write recently. One was, firstly, I'm not interested in belonging to any community that is too sure of who is out and who is in, who is saved and who is damned. And therefore, for anyone, and this is not specifically a Christian thing, but anyone who needs to divide the world along those lines, my invitation is to assume that I'm out. And then the second thing is, like, this last year, having been very much, the first time since I was, speaking or writing in any context where anyone was paying any attention, in which I've been trying to speak about and from and through the kind of the Christian roots of, what made me who I am. I suddenly had this moment of going, the image of roots is used very cheaply a lot of the time. We talk about our roots as if they're something we can opt in or out of, as if they belong to the past, something we can connect with or disconnect with. And I'm like, I'm not sure a tree would understand that way of speaking. Like, the roots are the bit that go below the ground, below the bit where it looks like you're separate and distinct and self-sufficient, into the place where all sorts of things that are necessary for life come from, and the place where you are in connection with the darkness, the hidden, the mysterious, and the webs of kind of hidden intelligence, mycelium, where the appearance of self-sufficiency and individuality is made a fool of by the reality of what is sustaining and connecting everything. And that, to me, if I flesh out the language of roots in those terms, then maybe it begins to carry for what my relationship is to, like, where I come from and what made me.
Yeah. I want to bring up something you that you sent to me, that a conversation that you had with our mutual friend John Clark, where you brought a picture of Iona, the abbey at Iona, and told a story about it that I found very resonant. And if you could maybe just tell that story again briefly.
Yeah, it's a story that comes from Alistair McIntosh, whose work has been hugely important to me. Like, when I was 25 and I just walked away from the beginnings of a career at the BBC, I stumbled on this book, Soil and Soul, which was Alistair telling the story of both the story of what made him and his culture and community and where he comes from, and these two big campaigns that he'd been involved in. On the one hand, the land reform campaign that started with the community buyout of the Isle of Egg in Scotland and extended to giving the right to community ownership to communities all over the Highlands and Islands. And the other one, this campaign to save this sacred mountain of Ronyaval on the island of Harris that was going to be, blasted to pieces to be used for the foundations of motorways. And one of the things that happens in the story is that Alistair and his friends in the campaign to save the mountain end up in contact with this Micmac warrior chief, Stone Eagle, in Canada, in a place which was colonized partly by people who came from the parts of Scotland that Alistair comes from, and where they had also been involved in a campaign to save a sacred mountain from this kind of industrial destruction. And they form this alliance, and Stone Eagle comes to Scotland to give theological testimony, because Alistair and his fellow troublemakers have established that whereas under English law, the sovereign is sovereign, the Queen or the King, under Scottish law, God is sovereign, and therefore theological testimony should be admissible before a public inquiry. And the judge is not terribly impressed by this, but they assemble, like the three of them, Alistair, who is a Quaker and is quite a prophetic figure, and this guy who's the sort of senior theologian of the Wee Frees, the Free Presbyterian Church of Scotland, which is very kind of hardcore Presbyterian denomination. And on the other hand, Chief Stone Eagle giving this Indigenous testimony. But there's a couple of chapters where Alistair is talking about the journey up through Scotland with Stone Eagle. And at one point they get to the village that's on the Isle of Mull across the water from the Isle of Iona. And they're meant to go on the ferry across that night and stay in the hostel at the Abbey. But there's a storm and they can't get across. And Stone Eagle's wife, who's a white Canadian woman, sort of says to Alistair quietly, you do realize that, it's quite a difficult thing for him to be going to this Christian site. He's of the generation of, where the experience of the church schools in Canada, the residential schools, was still absolutely like not even recent history, but present tense experience. And the next morning, the waters have calmed and the boat is able to go, and they do go across to the island. And he describes this extraordinary moment of Stone Eagle's response, stepping onto that bit of land. And his first thing is, I didn't know your people had places like this. And then he turns and he says, if you had places like this, how could you come and do what you did to our places like this? So there is this recognition of this being a sacred place. And I don't think that's just about, what was there before St. Columba or the first abbey or whatever was there. To me, it's pretty clear from the way that story is told that it includes a recognition of what is held in those walls of, what is a rebuilt ruin, and all of the history and all of the generations of accreted prayer within the stone of those buildings. I think that's part of what he's reacting to in that kind of double reaction. And for me, it was part of what's so important for me about that book and about Alistair having been the person who woke me up to so much of this stuff, was that it was someone coming from where my own recent ancestors came from. Like I said, my grandmother was from Scotland. It's not far from home. And Alistair was literally in that book describing growing up in the tail end of a vernacular culture, the vernacular culture that was coexisting with generations of colonialism in Scotland. And so for me, when I stumbled later on into working with Vanessa Andreotti from the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective and others, and learning a lot more about what decoloniality brings to the table of these conversations, I'd already been introduced to that by someone who I couldn't exoticize or romanticize in the way that we sometimes see happening when Indigenous voices are coming to the table from other parts of the world. I think that helped me into the kinds of dialogue and collaboration that I ended up stumbling into later. But yeah, I mean, that story of Alistair and Stone Eagle arriving at Iona Abbey gets more powerful for me with the years.
Yeah, it was really powerful for me because it was so resonant with my own experience, where as I was kind of coming out of this period of being involved in activism and at that tail end being in the environmental activism and um, people in general, there's this sense you talked about this in modern culture. We have somehow been cut off from this wisdom that we should have learned at a very young age, right? About how to survive and do just the practical things of being able to get food and create, grow food for ourselves and that kind of stuff, but also of that deeper work of connecting with, frankly, the sacredness and the spirituality of the land and place and people who've come before us. Um, and so there's often this idea that either, well, you have to go to indigenous people and get it from them, and that can sometimes turn into um, fetishization or appropriation, or just kind of putting a bigger burden on them than sometimes they even want to bear sometimes. And you would hear sometimes people who were indigenous say, but you should also look to you've got this in your past as well. And the way a lot of people take this sometimes is they think, well, I've got to go back and find out what my ancestors were doing 1,000 years ago when they were Vikings or something like that, before everything got ruined with Christianity. And when I started asking this question for myself. What did my ancestors do? How did they relate to the land? And it's funny, one of the first things I started doing was I watched this, it was like a documentary series from the UK called Tales from the Green Valley, about like where these historians and archaeologists go to recreate a Stuart era farm. So like 1600s, and they live on it. And it was just interesting to me to see how much they were reusing everything, and like everything was seasonal, and everything was like, there were just these like traditions that people were following that said, this is the time to repair the buildings for the cows, because this is when the trees are at the right stage of growth and all of that stuff. So that was really interesting to me. And I started thinking, well, that would have been the era when my ancestors were coming to America. The first ones were starting to come to America is that Stuart era. And then I don't know, it just kind of got me interested more. And I ended up in 2021 coming and spending 3 months in the UK. And I kind of felt like I just was intuitively guided that I needed to spend the first month in Northern Wales. So I did that. This was just as things were just kind of starting to open up after the pandemic. So I had to quarantine for 10 days. But I was sitting there in Northern Wales and going to a lot of these ancient sites on like the Isle of Anglesey and in Gwynedd there. And I just remember being, I think it was at St. Cyril's Church one day. And there's a sacred well there. There's still an extant church, but there's also ruined priory buildings, and of course, ancient graveyard. And I just had this, I thought, because I'm familiar with a lot of these fights that the Native Americans have had in the US to preserve some of their sacred places. And a lot of times they'll talk about this is the place of our ancestors, this is where their bones are buried, this is sacred place, you can't mine it, you can't cut the mountaintop off, whatever. But I said, well, wait a minute, like that's exactly what this place is, right? It's a place where there's a kind of unique natural feature. In this case, it's not only beautiful and you're on the island and close to the sea, but there's this well, this healing well, and the bones of the ancestors are all here. And you have the saint who is almost like the spirit of the place, the tutelary spirit, and we had our own ancestral sort of veneration practice. It's not really that old. And I thought about this too, because one of my very early ancestors that came over in 1640, I believe, was a Catholic recusant. And I thought about the fact that here you've got in this Protestant Reformation, and I am Protestant, I grew up Protestant, which we think about as this blow for freedom against the tyranny of the Catholic Church. And like any movement, it once you start to kind of create this narrative around these are the good people and these are the evil people, what do they start to do? They start to dismantle all of these practices, and demonize these practices that actually keep us tied to the dead and to the land and in relationship with them. And I just had this really palpable sense, because although I am Protestant, I'm kind of Catholic in a lot of the way I approach things, and that I've always had kind of a magical sort of way of relating to the world. And I pray the rosary and things like that. And so I just had this sense of like, people like my ancestor, Henry Spinks, preserving some of these traditions and wanting to go to a place where they could still practice them. And yet most of the people that are coming have been cut off from that. And this is really what kind of creates America, is you've got these people who have gone through this great trauma and rupture of having been cut off from a lot of their ancestral traditions. And that it's not just, the older ways, the pre-Christian ways are often woven into that, not in that people were practicing some sort of crypto-paganism, but in that you had these vernacular Christianities where people were taking the raw material that they already had in their culture and creating ways of being Christian that were kind of unique to place and culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I remember around the same time I read Soil and Soul, I sort of moved back in with my parents for a few months, but my dad had moved to a new church at the other end of the country. And so it was moving home, but not to a home that was home to me. And I was living in Havant on the border between Hampshire and Sussex for a few months. And I had a car with the job that I was doing. And partly to stay sane, I started taking the car out and just driving around the villages and lanes around there weekends, including visiting little old churches. And there are Saxon churches in that part of England, so really, really old. And in one of them, just on one of these kind of little notices that you pick up on a wooden thing to guide the visitor around the church, just had this sort of 2-line reference to, and this over here was the Devil's Door. Mm-hmm. And I went away and looked up and I realized, so the Devil's Door was the north door. It was the door of the church, which the people used for those occasions to which the priest was not invited. And this is what I love about it is the kind of the combination of tension and coexistence implicit in everything, including the naming of it. This is a coming to terms between there being ongoing practices that predate this having become a church and practices that belong to it being a church, and that they share the building, they share the site. And then I realized that this was ringing a bell, because I grew up reading the novels of Alan Garner, who is sort of known as one of the great British fantasy writers of the second half of the 20th century. And weirdly, around the same time that my dad was hanging out with Rowan Williams when they were both undergraduates in Cambridge, my mum was a nurse on a children's ward in Manchester, looked after one of Alan Garner's children and became friends with him and his wife, and sort of slightly adopted into their world for a while. And much, much later, I ended up becoming friends with Alan Garner and introducing him to Rowan Williams, who had written about his work. That's another story, really. But in Alan's novel, Strandloper, which is set in this part of rural Cheshire that his family comes from, where they've been living for at least 400 years and probably much longer, there's this opening section in this village around the church Marton, which is a beautiful wooden church, where in the first decade of the 19th century, there is a kind of one of these things to which the priest is not necessarily invited, which is in many ways a fertility ritual, which is also a highly syncretic It's Alan imaginatively, but through a huge amount of research, reconstructing a plausible thing that could be happening that late on in rural northern England. And it's exactly that thing of, as you say, people want to reach back to before it was contaminated. Whereas actually, what we have is you don't have to look very far to find all these different patterns of coexistence and interweaving, and also, patterns that move in the opposite direction of expulsion and of the same moves that were being pursued to greater extremes at the colonial end of the new world that was being created in the generations around when your first ancestors were moving to the Americas, were being perpetrated gradually to varying degrees within Europe itself to remake the patchwork of vernacular cultures into these new things called nation states with single languages, and where, when Alan Garner was a child in the 1930s and 40s, he got his mouth washed out with soap for talking broad, i.e. speaking his own language in school. So, not to the same extent, but not that, unrecognizably differently, the same patterns of cultural destruction in the name of the national and imperial centers were being pursued right into like my parents' lifetimes in the landscapes that I grew up in. And this is all like part of what we're reconnecting to. I heard you speak about ancestral Christianity, and that being one way of being in relation with what we're born into. And that struck a chord with me. And that ancestral Christianity isn't going so far back, or that connection to ancestors isn't going so far back that we get ancestors who present us with a clean page onto which we can project, because we've decided that it's no longer okay to project onto the indigenous folks somewhere else. It actually involves staying with the trouble of what's much closer to hand within the more complex histories than the ways that they've often been told to us of the places where our recent ancestors came from.
Yeah. That idea of staying with the trouble, I think, is so important. Because it's one of the things I was listening to something that you had sent me where I don't remember his name, but he's kind of talking, the writer is talking about his own kind of fraught relationship with Christianity, and he's talking to an Episcopal priest who's almost kind of speaking to him a little bit apologetically and saying, well, I don't like to call myself a Christian. I'm a Christ follower because I want to sort of like, detangle myself from that troubling aspect. And I think part of the reason it's been so important for me to be able to say, like, no, I am a Christian, is because I just don't. First of all, because I've explored enough and been involved in enough, I think, different environments and projects that there's no way I'm going to go where people are not human, and that that is not problematic, right? And that actually that is a profoundly Christian, I think, value, is to understand that, like, as one of my friends paraphrases scripture, he says, all are problematic and fallen short of the wokeness of goddess, like it's there's no place we can be absent from it. And so being with that trouble, and I think within Christianity, we also have some of the remedy, which is the saying, like, you have to look at that in yourself, not from a place of extreme guilt and shaming yourself, but you just have to acknowledge, like, I'm not really any different from these other people that I perceive as being the problem. And I have to understand that there, but for the grace of God, go I, and looking at history, you just see this over and over again with any sort of movement for reform or progress, that it's almost always coming out of a real need and a good impulse, and it almost always ends up recreating in some ways the old dynamic that it's trying to get away from.
Or or worse, that what we end up with in our supposedly post-Christian Western contexts is a doctrine of sin without forgiveness or grace.
Yeah,
And that just becomes a circular firing squad. And
absolutely.
that's, the stuff that I've seen you navigating and really appreciated. And other friends like Reed Wildermuth, who would would be pretty alienated by some of the stuff we're talking about when it comes to Christianity, but does a great job of helping to sort of open up this space of what goes missing and what becomes damaging in often the best intentions of the stuff which, for want of a better label, ends up getting talked about as the woke. It's precisely this for me anyway, and that's what I hear in what you're saying, it's precisely this reproduction of elements of Christianity, because again, and this is part of what the sort of 20th century theology stuff that I dip into offers, is this thing of it's harder to get out of Christianity than you think it is. I think that's Karl Barth, who's like, it's a lot harder to stop being Christian than you think it is. Or there's a lovely Jewish story about this boy who declares to his parents as he's coming up to his bar mitzvah, I'm an atheist. And they're a bit nonplussed by this, and they talk to their friends at synagogue, and everyone talks to everyone, and then someone knows of an atheist, and he's like 3 towns over, and so they send the boy and say, look, you need to go off and you need to go and see this man. And he arrives at the guy's house and knocks on the door, and his wife answers and says, oh, he's not here, he's at synagogue. And the boy's like, but why is he at synagogue? He's an atheist. And the wife is like, well, just wait for him and he'll come back. And the guy comes back, and he asks, why did you go to service when you're an atheist? And it's like, they were only 11 men. They needed me. He's like, yeah, but being an atheist means not believing in God. And he's like, no, not believing in God just makes you an idiot. Being an atheist is really hard work. And, like, there's an extent to which, a bit like, I don't know if you've ever read Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. Like, I finally found my way to it this last year, and the opening of it is him in this really kind of ironical mode going on about, wow, he's so amazed by all of his peers in this sort of, whatever it is, 1840s Copenhagen, who have progressed beyond faith. And he's like, wow, like, I'm just sitting here reading and reading and rereading the story of Abraham and Isaac, and I can't even like imagine getting to faith. And you guys, wow, you've managed to get even beyond it. And for me, that sort of still speaks to the kind of the easy assumption of, like, look, there's a huge amount of damage, real damage, that's been done by Christianity, by churches, in the name of Christianity, that is real and appallingly badly accounted for and responded to. And that's part of why the end of the institutional forms that we've inherited is hard to mourn, because of how bound up they've been with so much of that. But there's also often a kind of cheap sense of having progressed beyond what Christianity was holding, a sort of cheap sense of superiority that can easily fuse with kind of New Age or whatever else, but into a kind of a kind of deprecation of Christianity that would not be made of any other tradition. Some of which is justified because we're talking amongst ourselves as the descendants of that tradition, and we are still only beginning to reckon with, and the institutions are failing on the whole to reckon with, the horrors that were done in its name. So some of it is understandable, but some of it does feel cheap to me, because it has that quality of having progressed beyond faith that Kierkegaard is trying to call into question, whatever it was 180 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way to put it. That it does feel cheap in a lot of ways. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. There's more I could say, but we are going to continue this conversation and turn to something that I'm very interested in talking about, which is, Ivan Illich, who I know has been a real sort of like a big influence on your work. And um, he was a Catholic priest, historian, and really interesting idiosyncratic thinker. We're going to talk a little bit more about him, and particularly his concept of the witch and how it relates to Christianity, and some of these ideas of rewilding, or maybe, I don't know if recovering is the right word, but like looking to some of these older, more syncretic forms of Christianity. But before we go to that, that's going to be for the subscriber portion. Dougald, can you just tell us where people can find you and what you've got coming up? Any events or anything like that?
Yeah, sure. So I'm really easy to find because I have a weird name. So if you just Google Dougald, you find most of the stuff. But the book that came out nearly a year ago, and that I'm still sort of traveling with and learning from and being led into all sorts of conversations by, is called At Work in the Ruins. And it's also available as an audiobook if you want to listen to even more of my voice. And then we have this thing, a school called Home, which exists partly where I'm sitting in this old shoe shop in this small Swedish town where Anna, my other half, and I have been making a home together. But also it exists partly like everything on the internet. And a couple of times a year, we make an invitation to an online series where you can spend a few weeks traveling with me and Anna and with a bunch of other people who've been drawn to our work, exploring some of the kind of questions that we've been talking about and some of the kind of things that I write about in the book. And then I'm on Substack writing home, and that's the easiest way to keep up with my work, is to sign up for the free version of writing home. And there's also a paid version where we do some other kind of live stuff and videos for those who want to get more closely connected.
Thank you. Hey everyone, if you'd like to hear the rest of this interview with Dougald, where we continue to talk about reclaiming ancestral Christianity, as well as Ivan Illich, you can head over to rebeccaburnt.substack.com. And for only $7 a month, you can get access to the rest of this interview, as well as a subscriber portion of all my other interviews. So hope to see you there.